Excellent. Well, it is now time to start. Can you all see my screen okay? Welcome to the Chicago Archaeological Society.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right, I'm going to mute you all temporarily. And let's see here. Maybe I could turn off that chime so it doesn't bother everybody. And first off, please note that we are recording the lecture. By participating, you are giving your consent to have your comments and questions recorded. And I want to say thank you to everybody in the Chicago Archaeological Society. I'm your president, Ray Young, and I want to say thank you to our members for your continued support. Without you, none of this would be possible. Also, thank you to the board and the volunteers. Your commitment is inspiring and bringing community and comfort to people in such difficult times. For those of you that are new to this group, we have a long history. From what I understand, started meeting way back in the 1920s when archaeology was still fairly new, and people often found indigenous tools and art by accident while farming in their backyards. By at least 1962, the name the Chicago Archaeological Society was being used, and our mission to study the existence of man was established. After 1969, we became a chapter of the Illinois Association for the Advancement of Archaeology, the IAAA. At this point, let's see. At this point, our mission was further expanded to unite all persons interested in the archaeology of Illinois, amateurs, professional students, and educators. By at least 1987, we were a paper organization with the state of Illinois. In short, like the IAAA, we focus on the regional. Did someone just comment? Someone unmuted themselves. Let's see here. In short, we're like the IAAA. We do focus on regional areas of interest, but in the pursuit of understanding mankind, we often venture off into the ancient Americas, such as the Mayas, and world archaeology, such as Egypt. If you become a member of the Chicago Archaeological Society, you will receive the Codex, which is our newsletter, which covers recent past events, lectures, future lectures, general news and events that regarding history, archaeology, anthropology. You will also get membership in the IAAA, the Illinois Association for the Advancement of Archaeology. And we'll get the newsletter, Illinois Antiquity, a journal for the Illinois Association for the Advancement of Archaeology, which has wonderful articles and photos of the work that's being done in the state of Illinois. If you'd like to learn more about our group and join, hopefully, check out chicagoarchaeologicalsociety.com and select join. Let's see here. All right, last month we had Dr. Logan Miller. That was it last month, though, October. We had Dr. Logan Miller speak about the recent investigations at Noble Wheaton Lingford Village in Central Illinois. Great talk. And next month, January 31st, 2021 at 3:30, we'll have Dr. Robert M. Morrissey, In the Middle of Everything, The Power of Indigenous Illinois in Early America. But today, we have the honor of having Dr. Jane Eva Baxter, Associate Professor of Anthropology at DePaul University in Chicago. She has previously done talks for our organization and tours of the historic Pullman neighborhood, which, if you don't already know, is part of the history of the labor movement in the United States and of the world. But today, she is speaking about above ground archaeology of the Chicago historical cemeteries. And let me unmute her. Give me just one moment here to find her on the list. All right, Dr. Baxter, can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. Can you hear me?
I can. All right, and I'm going to turn the slides over to you. Give me just a moment here. Okay.
Now I should be able to share my screen.
Yep.
Here we go.
Excellent.
Right. So I'm gonna start this, and then I'm also gonna move all these little widgets. I found if I keep them over where Zoom wants to put them, I look shifty-eyed the whole time during my talk as I'm trying to look down the column of people watching me speak. So thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me to come back. I will begin with some preliminary here. My computer's just gonna have to get used to what it's doing here. A little frozen. See if I can, there we go, okay. I just want to start with a land acknowledgement, which is how we begin our talks. They say, if you know better, do better, and this is something we've been asked to do by Native communities. And I also will say that this land acknowledgement is absolutely taken from the Field Museum website. So I use theirs for the description of the land acknowledgement of use of the land before Europeans arrived here in Chicago. I also want to thank the Chicago Archaeological Society. You are all a team. One person does the meeting, one person does the inviting, one person sends the check, one person, does all the PR stuff, and you've all been so wonderful to work for in doing your part. So thank you so much to all of you for this collective effort, and for those of you who are attending. It's really fantastic. I also just want to make sure you know that all of the photos used in this talk are either freely available on the internet, or I cite where they come from, and a lot of them come from my partner, who one of the great things about our relationship when we met, he was predisposed to loving historic cemeteries. So it didn't have to start dragging him, and he loves to take photos. So he's responsible for a lot of the photos that you will see today. I could give a much longer introduction to what I'm going to do in this talk, but because it's going to fill up the time so that we have some time for Q&A, I'm just going to get started and say that it comes in 4 sections. I'm going to introduce the history of cemeteries, transition that to Chicago cemeteries, talk a little bit about how I'm approaching cemeteries as an archaeologist, using non-excavation techniques to study cemeteries, and then finally present a little bit from some of my published work on children in cemeteries. So to begin with, I just wanted to say that this map on the right is not a map I would ever create, because it is so, in fact, so crowded. But that's what makes it really wonderful to introduce this talk. We are surrounded by cemeteries. There are over 200 in Cook County. There are even more within the city of Chicago. And so it means that all of us interact with cemeteries, at least in a passive way, quite regularly in our lives. We drive by them, we go to see them, perhaps for other purposes, but they're an integral part of the landscape. I would also say that Chicago has a lot of famous cemeteries, largely because of stories of hauntings. And I just put 3 here. On the top left is Bachelor's Grove Cemetery, which appears over and over again on top 10 most haunted in America lists, which is a pretty impressive designation, but it calls attention. The story of Inez Clark at Graceland Cemetery is often called out, although I've done research there and can tell you that there are graves of over 200 of her child contemporaries that you can see if you go to visit. Hers is singled out, and there are stories surrounding her, and she's heavily, she's an attraction at Graceland. And then on the bottom, I chose Resurrection Mary, who is interesting because she, in the 1920s and 30s, was one of hundreds of vanishing hitchhikers ghost stories that occurred around the United States. But for some reason, this one just outside Chicago persisted longer than almost any other into the 70s and 80s. There were reports of sightings of her. So she's been a longer ghost in sort of this genre than any other in the country. So Chicago cemeteries are things you'll also encounter in other kinds of places and contexts, not just as we as relatively local people see them driving around the landscape. But what I want to do, this is a group where, based on our sort of the banter that was going on before the talk, a lot of people are very comfortable with cemeteries, have learned a lot about cemeteries, know a lot about cemeteries, but I do want to give a little bit of an introduction to this particular type of cultural institution, because like so many things in our own society, we often don't think about the fact that they have a very specific history, that our cemeteries are not the same thing as cemeteries that existed in other times and places. They all have their unique history. And this is not a paid endorsement, but I will say, if any of you have time during quarantine, I will recommend this book, The Work of the Dead, 600 pages. It is a commitment, by Thomas LeCaire. And he does a wonderful job of bringing about sort of origins of cemeteries. I'm starting to reread it again, and it is as amazing the second time as it was the first for me, and thinking about the importance of cemeteries as features of our lives and of the landscapes that we live in. So let me start by giving an introduction of why we are surrounded by cemeteries and where these get their start. So our cemeteries have their roots in Europe, specifically in Christian traditions. When Christianity kind of comes out of the closet, out of privacy, and institutions for public worship become accessible, it becomes no longer dangerous. So we're looking a little over 1,000 years ago. Most of the earliest churches in Europe, if they have remaining architecture at their core, is Carolingian, dating to the time of Charlemagne, and then Ettonian and Romanesque, and the Gothic cathedrals that we still see today. Those churches really come about when it becomes okay to be publicly Christian, and there can be these communities of Christians. And one of the things that becomes a relatively common practice is, if you are in some way considered a particularly holy person, or you're a particularly wealthy or prominent person, you started to be buried inside the church. And this allowed you a couple of things. It allowed you to remain a part of the community. Churches were incredibly important social places. It really extended your life into the afterlife by being present when people came to worship. And it also created a direct association between you and God. You were buried in God's house. And these are just a couple really famous early examples. St. Peter, who you can go see in the crypt at the Vatican, or if you go to Westminster Abbey, which many of you maybe have, and seen all of the kings and queens of England that are on display, and other famous people, it allows you to see them in God's house. And that's an important part of this early tradition. Eventually, and as churches spread, and as more and more people are able, this association is expanded to other parts of the population. It might be the most prominent people in a particular town or particular community, or the wealthiest, but almost every church that came up, not just the most prominent, would have crypts where you could be buried in the walls or in the basement. And so these are just a couple of examples. This is one that up in the upper left here, this is in Kilkenny, Ireland, where not all the remains have been taken from the crypt. And in addition to having your remains in the house of God, you would have some kind of marker above, either like this on the floor or this on the wall in the center, that let people know who were coming to the church and using the church that you were in fact buried in God's house. Now I'm going to tell you the first of a theme that you're going to see. You know, it's like history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. We're going to see this repeating theme of overcrowding and having to solve the problem. Being buried in the floor and in the walls of the church is a good idea until people keep dying and you start running out of space. You reach a point where you can't keep fitting people in. You can also think about the fact that these are non-climate controlled buildings, and there's no embalming during this time period, and you're stuffing the church full of living people that literally have dead corpses in the walls and under the floorboards. It's not enhancing Mass. It's not enhancing your religious experience to have all these corpses in the same building as you. So what happened is they cleared out most of these crypts. And what you can see, these are two examples here on the right. So this is obviously me in the upper right. I'm having a coffee in the crypt of St. Paul's in England, in London. And then this is my partner Jim eating in the crypt of St. Martin in the Field, one of the most wonderful places to get a cheap pre-theater meal in London. But they've cleaned out the crypts and they now use them for other kinds of things. What they did is extended the concept of sacred and holy space. So God doesn't just have a house anymore, he has a really big lawn. You consecrate the area around the church, and you create church burying grounds. So burying grounds is a common term, graveyards is a common term. In some places, like here on the left, you also have cloisters. This is at St. Sebastian's in Austria, in Salzburg. And then these are both in Ireland, but they're examples of what these graveyards looked like. And really, they were functional places where you died and you got the next plot. And so plots were just given sequentially in the order people were passing away in the community. And the monuments were there. People could still see you, have that social association. When they came to church, they'd walk by people's gravestones and be able to see. And they also were in not God's house, but in God's lawn. they had that association to the house of God. It's important to note, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but that graveyards and burying grounds aren't the same thing as cemeteries. We often use the words interchangeably, but they're actually really not. You can see from these examples, again, in Ireland, that the graves are designed in ways that don't invite visitation. And a lot of these pathways, like the one you can see from Kilkenny, are later additions to facilitate people being able to come into the church. So these graveyards were places where people were buried, but not necessarily where you had ongoing rituals of visitation. And it's this particular institution that comes to the United States in the colonies. So these are American examples, early American colonial examples of churchyards and burying grounds. So on the left, you can see the graveyard, the burying ground that surrounds St. Philip's Church in Charleston. Here on the right, if you've ever done the Freedom Trail in Boston, this is the Granary burying ground where Samuel Adams and John Hancock and Mother Goose are. And you can see the similar look where it's just a row after row after row of grave. Now, some of this is done because preservationists have put them back in nice, neat rows, but this is also much more like what the design was like. In the center, you can see this is the reconstructed church at Jamestown, Virginia. So the church was reconstructed in 1907, but we know from archaeological excavations, people are buried under the floor at Jamestown. A lot of the excavations at Jamestown have focused on the people who were buried under the floorboards. And you can see the plaques on the walls still letting you know who was buried in the floorboards or directly outside the church. So this tradition from Europe is what comes over to the United States. But the same problem that we have with burying people in churches starts to plague American cities and in England. Actually, this is a parallel problem. So there's a lot going on between the United States and in England and in other places in Europe around the Industrial Revolution. And what happens at that time is you have an incredible draw to cities. Cities experience unprecedented growth during the Industrial Revolution, and these once ample churchyards and burying grounds that were created for the convenience of these colonial cities are no longer adequate. Historical sources tell us things like that overcrowding was a problem, that bodies were being buried stacked one on top of the other. Some bodies were being buried as shallow as 1 foot below the ground and were later being dug up by animals, which you can imagine is socially and emotionally traumatizing. And also they started to realize unhygienic, that this is not really healthy to have this kind of situation persisting. So the solution was to establish a new kind of cultural institution, which was the cemetery. These are commonly known as rural garden cemeteries. And it was a movement that started in Boston and spread across the United States all the way to the West Coast. There are examples of these rural garden cemeteries. So just to give you a sense, this is the city of Boston, my home city. And over here is Mount Auburn. So Mount Auburn was built on the outskirts of Cambridge. Here's Cambridge, where Harvard University is. But you can see the relationship is quite far between Boston and Mount Auburn Cemetery. So in 1831, when Mount Auburn was built, it was built way outside the city limits, and it had to be accessed by horse and carriage or eventually by train line. So the connection to the city, it was one of great distance. And we'll see this repeat in Chicago as well. And the idea was these would be large, ample spaces that would create segregated and therefore more healthy spaces for the dead and the living and solve this problem of overcrowding. These cemeteries were actually not municipal endeavors. So while I say this was the Rural Garden Cemetery for Boston, it was, but it was not founded by the city of Boston. These are private corporations. So as capitalism is kicking in, these are capitalist endeavors. A group of people would get together, purchase up some land, and there's money in death. It is certain you will have clients. So it's a great investment, and businessmen did this as an auxiliary investment. But because these were built well in advance and were built on land that had been sold and had boundaries, this idea of a planned cemetery emerges. So this is very different than the more organic graveyard that is coming about just as people pass away. You're using land around the church. These were pre-designed. And I'd like to show you a couple things about the design. For starters, you can see that it has a fence line or some boundaries that go all the way around it. So there is a clear separation, symbolic separation, if you will, as well as practical separation between the dead and the living. You have to choose to enter into the world of the dead. And traditionally in rural garden cemeteries, there was only one place to do that. There's one opening. And I will say, if you want to go see this, you can do this on Google Earth and go on Street View and actually follow the Google car through Mount Auburn Cemetery. I have my students do it, and it's really fun. And it gives you a sense of the landscape on the ground as it is today. Mount Auburn is not only the oldest, but it's one of the least altered initial 19th century landscapes, cemetery landscapes in the country. So for example, when we talk about Rose Hill has an original entrance, but it had to be expanded in the city of Chicago, and it was expanded out to Western Avenue. So it now has two entrances, but traditionally it only had one. So you have this segregated planned space, and as you can see, it's designed to look not like a city. This is this rural garden idea at a time when America is losing its touch with the countryside, its touch with its agrarian roots, and people are starting to work in factories and move to cities. These were designed as spaces that would allow people to come back to a rural past and explore their roots. So if you look at this, you can see there are lakes, there's topography down here. This is a big hill in Mount Auburn. It has a beautiful view. I always tell people when I was in college, this was actually like a date spot. Like if a guy took you to Mount Auburn to have a picnic, it was like serious business. Like it was like you knew you weren't just dating anymore. He was really interesting because the view is gorgeous, very romantic, beautifully landscaped. But you can also see all of these like winding, curving roads. They're not supposed to have that industrial order. The names are all evocative of country spaces. You can find these online in any number of places. But this is sort of the idea, to have these planned natural spaces, which is ironic, but it's the way it is. Because these are planned spaces, people could pre-purchase burial plots, which is something we are encouraged to do now. It was not something people did in burying grounds or cemetery or graveyards before. And it meant that you could make choices about where you were buried, the relative cost of your choice, who your neighbors were going to be, and your relationship between your grave and other people. So 19th century rural garden cemeteries were actually designed so that people could replicate the living social order in their final neighborhood, right? So here we are for all eternity. I'm big and important. I have this grave up here on a hill, and I'm literally looking down at other people. Or in some cases, I really want to be buried next to people who I knew in life and enjoyed in life, or members of my religious congregation, or members of the same ethnic group. You could actually replicate that in the landscape. These are from Crown Hill, just, you know, in Indianapolis. These are not Chicago images either. Crown Hill is the 4th largest rural garden cemetery in the United States. It's been expanded many times, but it is a spectacular cemetery to go visit. All of this is also involved in a broader movement around death that happens in the 19th century. So these elaborate cemeteries, elaborate spaces, elaborate monuments come as what historians have termed beautification of death. And it's a cultural movement that embraces death while also denying it at the same time. And there's a whole suite of things, and I'm going to go over them really quickly because I think it helps us think about cemeteries as one part. And I think as archaeologists, it's always important when we're looking at material things to realize we're only looking at one part of a very complex set of social practices. Some don't preserve, some are intangible. But in this case, we can see all of these relationships. So just sort of going from left to right, you can see this is a memento mori photograph. So the young girl in the center is actually deceased. And she is photographed with her grieving parents in their living room in a lifelike posture. So this is part of this beautification of death. You're denying that death happened. These photographs would be taken and displayed prominently in family homes as family photos. They'd be in the living room. This is in part now, taking photos is about the cheapest way that you can commemorate any event. We pick up our phone and snap away. In the 19th century, it was expensive. And often, especially when young children passed away, they hadn't had a photo taken yet. So this is the one chance the family had to commemorate the fact that this child existed in the context of their family. And so these were taken and displayed quite readily and quite comfortably. So there's this sense that death can be sanitized and beautified in a way. We also have here in the middle something that becomes increasingly elaborate, which is the need to wear particular clothing and engage in certain materials or activities during a period of mourning. Of course, Queen Victoria, after the death of Prince Albert, absolutely popularized this. Her look changes and you see her in mourning wear for the rest of her life. But it becomes very popular to have this extended period of mourning. Historians have said that this is actually, all of these things can be interpreted, and I think effectively, in response to industrialization and capitalism. And that one thing that mourning time did for people is it allowed them to have time that wasn't about work, but it was about family and relationships and care. It broke that pattern. And they marked this in very specific material ways. And so it also comes into the cemetery. You have these very elaborate and personal monuments. They express grief, often more than concern about what happened to the person after they had died. And it's where you start to see euphemisms appear on tombstones about death. So saying asleep in Jesus or at rest instead of here lie the mortal remains of is part of this beautification of death. All of this can be seen as a way of Americans at the time coping with the disruption to the American family caused by industrialization. You didn't work with your family anymore. You didn't see them all day. Your children went to school. The father went to work. All of these things were happening. And generally, family time was dinner time and Sundays. And this was in a very different idea of family life than many people had experienced in their own youth. Cemeteries, in many ways, in this whole beautification of death, props up the American family. You buy a family plot. Our family will be together forever. People who have died aren't dead, they're asleep. They're just waiting for us. We're going to see them again. So this becomes a really important 19th century message. An integral part of this is, as we were mentioning before, cemetery visitation, that it was expected that you would go to cemeteries. I always tell my students, people wouldn't spend money on monuments telling you about their lives if they didn't think you were going to come and look. I mean, why would you do that otherwise? And you wouldn't need to put the details of your life on a headstone if the only people you thought were going to come were your family. They'd know. You're putting all this information there for strangers, for people you don't know, because at the time they passed away, it was expected that cemeteries would be full of living people. They were parklands. You came to commune with nature. You came to commune with God. You came to learn lessons from the headstones. You came to get a respite from life in the city. If you were a tourist, and this was true in Chicago as well as anywhere else. I've included, this is for the, you see, for the benefit of strangers. This is a published guide in the 19th century to Mount Auburn Cemetery. There were published guides to all of Chicago's main cemeteries. In the 19th century, if you traveled someplace, you stayed for an extended period of time. You'd unpack your steamer trunk and you were there, because it wasn't that easy to get back and forth. One of the things you would do to be a well-cultured tourist is go to the office for the cemeteries, which were always downtown. Chicago had one building where all the Chicago cemetery offices were, and you would get a guide, and you would take the time to take the train or a horse and carriage out to the cemetery and spend a day enjoying it. There were etiquette books, what to wear, what to eat, what to say, how to look at gravestones. All of those things are provided in these 19th century guidebooks. So the idea is that these are places that you're supposed to go to and spend time in. Obviously, something has changed radically because cemetery visitation is only now, again, sort of gaining a somewhat greater acceptance after a period of it just not being acceptable at all. And a few things happen. Wars happen. And so the amount of death that people experience in the early 20th century becomes overwhelming. It's not the idea of celebrating and mourning and going through all of these rituals when so many people are dying, becomes, I think, impractical, but also probably emotionally very difficult. I just put some of the statistics up there so you can see in the United States and in the UK why this would have been something that was happening, sort of just too much death. I think we're living in that time at this moment too. It feels like so much to look at the New York Times every day and see the number of people who are dying. It's shocking. Here we go again with the overcrowding. In another way, our population is continuing to grow, and cemeteries need to become more efficient. And this is my second, I haven't read this book yet, so I can't plug it at all, but it is my break reading. It's called The Cemetery of Dead, and it's a 2018 University of Chicago Press publication. Get the author's name up there. By David Charles Sloan. And he's absolutely looking at a time where these spaces are becoming taxed, where memorials are going online, where we are looking at all these alternative forms of burial and cremation. Our cemetery is going to survive. And I'm hoping he concludes yes, because I really like them, but I'm not sure he does. I'll let you all know if you want to ask me in January when I'm done reading it. But it's an interesting question. We're again at this sort of, these cemeteries aren't doing the job anymore. And that's starting to become very clear in the early 20th century as well. Another thing that happens is all of these monuments are a pain to take care of. They are super high maintenance. All of these cemeteries offered perpetual care as a way of bringing clients in. It's hard to take care of them. It's hard to drive a lawnmower around them to keep the grounds looking nice. And actually, people started to find them just really tacky. They found it sort of this cluttered, busy, unattractive landscape, the opposite of what a 19th century American would have liked. More is more is the decoration style of the 19th century. If you can put a pattern on it, put a pattern on it. And they sort of replicate that in their tombstones. It's not the same aesthetic anymore in the 20th century, so people don't want to do it. One of the things that I think, and this is not something that people have written about so much, but thinking about this in a material way, is the way, excuse me, we choose to commemorate military dead is more uniform, more simple, reflects a certain kind of organization of the military. Whatever your rank and role was, it's written on the stone, but your stone looks just like the person next to you. Death is the great equalizer. There's no need to build a 40-story obelisk to show that you're different than somebody else. We're all in the same boat here. And our cemeteries start to reflect that. I mean, over here on the right, this is a very typical 20th century look. The stones are smaller. They're much more uniform. There's only a small amount of variation in stone material and size that you start to see in cemeteries. They start to look much more regular again in their spacing. And I think there's a different sensibility of how the military and civilian worlds are informing themselves at this time. I think now with new technology, we're starting to see a move again towards personal differentiation, because you can actually have whatever you want laser etched onto this granite, right? So if somebody liked fishing, they'd put a fishing scene. If you liked bingo, you get a bingo card. If you want a picture of you and your husband or you and your wife, they can etch that into the stone. So actually, personalization is picking up again. But I think that these ideas inform a lot of what we see in the 20th century. And again, here's the other thing. These new cemeteries that are often just called memorial parks or memorial gardens, they're shedding the word cemetery, are much more efficient. You can mow them really easily. You can run a lawnmower over them without giving anything another thought. You can handle a lot more cremations and therefore a lot more burials. So they're much more efficient. So what I wanted to do is sort of give you a sense of the fact that what we see now has a very, very particular history that makes our cemeteries different than ones we might see in other places in the world when we go to visit cemeteries. So let's talk just a little bit about how this manifests itself in Chicago. This is from a 1955 article by a geographer, William Pattison. And I've put the red dot at State and Madison, so the 00 on the Chicago grid. And you can see the city cemetery, which I'll talk about in a second, starting to emerge here. It's an amalgamated cemetery that includes Catholic and Jewish cemeteries, along with those populations that don't require a particular burying space. But you can also see within the city limits, here's a town cemetery, a village cemetery, a cholera cemetery, a church cemetery, a town cemetery. What were originally smaller settlements that eventually became Chicago had their own cemeteries. And these were consolidated, right? There was sort of a move, these don't work anymore. These aren't villages and towns anymore. It's the city of Chicago. Burials were moved, maybe some weren't moved, into this city cemetery along the lakefront. And this is taken from the really wonderful project that the artist Pamela Banos did on the Chicago City Cemetery that has an incredible website, but also a series of markers with maps and QR codes. So you can walk through the old cemetery, use the QR code on the back of the monument to learn about where you're standing in the old city cemetery and what was once there, as well as sort of where you are on this particular map. So we have this consolidation happening already in the 1830s. And what happens? In 1859, the city says, we've got to move everybody, right? I mean, I think there's a lot of things. I'm not sure why you would put a large cemetery right next to your water source. I'm not sure why you would put a large cemetery on really important economic, lakefront property sells, it still does, the cost of living on the lakefront. And I think they realized like this was just no longer practical. And frankly, Fullerton Avenue was no longer farmland. It was starting to be populated. It was starting to grow. And they were saying the city's growing. This isn't going to work. We need to move the cemetery. So these are a couple of images. This is the famous couch tomb that is a remainder of that city cemetery. There's a section devoted to it on that Hidden Truths website of all the varying theories people have of why this one mausoleum was strangely not moved when almost every other marked grave was. And then these are an image from that same site. And what you can see is if you had a family member, what the law required is if you had a family member buried in the city cemetery and you wanted to have them moved, you had to write a note letting them know you wanted the body to be exhumed and what you would like to have done with it. And this only worked if the grave was marked, if people knew where your loved one was. It didn't work for unmarked graves, for big pauper graves, right? And it's still estimated that there are as many as 10,000 people under Lincoln Park that were never moved because they had nobody to vouch for them, and it's an expensive process. So in 1859, all of these the city of Chicago, groups of businessmen come along and do the exact same thing as the people who founded Mount Auburn. They put together consolidated groups and purchased land outside the city and built cemeteries. So here is just some pictures of Graceland, Rose Hill, and Oakwoods, all of which make claims to being the first cemetery in the city of Chicago for any number of reasons. Interestingly enough, Oakwoods got its charter in 1853, which is before the mandate from the aldermen. And what I find really interesting is they had to go the extra mile to secure legal stature from the state of Illinois so that they could advertise that their cemetery would never be moved, that no law could ever eradicate this cemetery's right to persist where it did. And to me, as I think about that, I think about, it says something about probably how people were feeling about having cemeteries moving and being disrupted, and this sort of turmoil around where to place the dead or what might happen to you after you were deceased. So that charter is very telling. The other thing I want to point out here that I'll mention in a minute is you can see here the Chicago and Milwaukee Railroad. This was a common feature of these. These are a little later. So Chicago already has rail lines coming in and out, and rail access is a critical part of where these lands were purchased for these rural garden cemeteries. Okay. So how do we get to the sort of cemeteries that we have today? What I did here on this map, so that you can see it, I hope fairly clearly, is here's the downtown area, the city of Chicago at the time in blue, and you can see Rose Hill, Graceland, and Oakwoods all on this map. And you can see how far they are from the city of Chicago. They are all on rail lines. If you go to Rose Hill, if you enter into the original gates from Ravenswood, you can still see the elevator in one of the pillars on the walls that took caskets from the rail grade level down into the cemetery. Similarly, in Oakwoods, if you take the Illinois Central, the Metro Electric, and you go down and at 67th Street, which is no longer a stop, it used to be because of Oakwoods, you will see the cemetery on the right, directly adjacent to the train tracks, and you will see a set of tracks that nobody uses that go down to street level. And it used to be to facilitate funerals and the movement of bodies to Oakwood Cemetery. So it was a critical aspect. But the other thing I want to call attention to is this need for constant expansion, right? We have second waves and third waves of cemeteries that have been built up in Cook County around Chicago. This graph shows you sort of how the population is constantly growing, how the accumulated number of deceased people. By 1950, over 2 million people have died in the city of Chicago. This number of cemeteries has had to grow, and the number of acres has had to grow. Many of these are down in the southwest suburbs off of Western Avenue because people could then drive there, and Western was the clear thoroughfare from the city. It's why Rainbow Cone Ice Cream is where it is. It was actually located on Western for families who were going to visit the cemeteries in the southwest suburbs on weekends, interestingly enough, and thank goodness for that sort of value-added attraction. So this is something that just kind of keeps growing and growing. I want to quickly talk about how I approach cemeteries, and then we should have some time for Q&A. I very much approach cemeteries as an archaeologist, which is not how other people necessarily look at them. I find them interesting because they allow us to see things in a very particular way, and this is true of any archaeological study of mortuary populations. We are able to see, at the one hand, the range of culturally accepted boundaries, if you will, of what's acceptable in terms of death, burial, and commemoration and mourning. But at the same time, we can see the individual choices that people are making. So it allows us not only to look at social organization as a question, but also how individuals participate in that social organization. And by looking at individuals, we can understand dynamics of gender, dynamics of race, ethnicity, all these social variables in terms of the choices they're making, in terms of how they want to participate in this social organization. Cemeteries, as we know, also can reflect aspects of a culture that are not readily reflected in other forms of material culture. Even in the 19th century, when people all of a sudden have houses with more stuff in them than any time before, most of them do not relate to the symbolic, cognitive, cosmological worlds that most people spend most of their time in. Cemeteries give us that. And as James Dietz let us know in his very early study of New England headstones, cemeteries, while they clearly move, that's been a big part of my talk, don't move very far, and everything is conveniently dated. So it's one of the nicest kinds of artifacts for archaeologists to work with, because you have this incredible continuity of time and place. And so I'm interested in the same kinds of archaeological questions that people are who are looking at mortuary populations anywhere and at any time, particularly things like demography, family history, social history, and also using material culture to look at things like class and status, using the exact same methods that an archaeologist in any time period would. What kind of raw materials are they? How long did it take to get there? What were their relative costs? How much did they use? How much writing is on the headstones? Based on that, how much capital are people putting into these commemorations? And of course, we can see this in historical documents as well. These are Sears and Roebuck catalog. You could buy your headstone from Sears and Roebuck in the 19th century. You could have them send you absolutely anything your household needed. And famously, people know that Sears and Roebuck sold houses, but they would also sell you your mortuary monument. We can also look then at the landscape and how people were using landscape to reinforce their social position and their affiliation with other people. So these are all dynamics that I use when I use my work on cemetery, or do my work on cemeteries. And this is a part of my research that I'm getting ready to expand in scope and scale in a really big way into a much bigger research project. Finally, we also get this incredible symbolic and textual element to our material culture. And one of the things that I just want to point out quickly with this slide is not only do you get text, which is obvious, the ability to read what's on the monument is really important. These are all from Oakwood Cemetery. But there's also this symbolic language that people in the 19th century understood that we don't. So you can buy books to actually learn it. It's kind of like learning a foreign language. And some of them are somewhat obvious. Obviously, we're commemorating someone's job here, someone's, this is much later, but the sort of using symbols we would recognize. But this is my favorite little girl from my previous studies. This is India Kephart, and she died when she was 6. And her parents clearly really missed her and loved her and made her a stone that absolutely stands out. And I don't know why, but I fell in love with India, and I bring her flowers, and I visit with her every time I go to Oakwoods. And she's sort of symbolic of all the children I've been able to spend time with during my research in the cemeteries. But India is sitting in a scallop shell, which you would know symbolizes the Christian journey of her life from start to end. It's a very poignant symbol in a cemetery. You can see she's resting. She's depicted as a sleeping child, which is that beautification of death movement. It's suggesting she's simply asleep, waiting for her parents to arrive. And she's clutching in her hands a doll, which is a really potent symbol of home and family. So in addition to the text, we have all of these symbols that we can kind of decode about individuals in the cemetery. So let me finish by talking just a little bit about how I've looked at children in Chicago cemeteries as an archaeological study. And then we'll have some time to get to questions and answers. So I've since expanded this to look at Graceland, but the work that I'm going to talk about mostly is the work that I did in Rose Hill and Oakwoods. And my thought was, when I embarked on this research, I was asked to do a project for a memorial volume for a woman who died when she was in her 30s, and she studied Bronze Age children in Europe, and I knew her, and they said, would you do something to honor her? And I said, sure, but I'm going to do something that's my own research. And so this really got me to do a systematic project. Is I thought, we think of Chicago as a single unit all the time, but I bet even in the 19th century, I was thinking, I bet the people in Rose Hill aren't doing the same things as the people in Oakwoods, that you could see variation in the Chicago community based on the geography of these cemeteries. Turns out I was right. But also I wanted to know how children were being commemorated, and how we could put the material culture of children's burials into a lot of literature that people have written about children in the 19th century. So I first went to the vital records. and did a little research on childhood death and how children were categorized. And I chose to do this particular period from 1867 to 1906. Strangely, that's the way decades are organized in Chicago Vital Records, and 1867 was the first year after that I could start looking at vital records where children would have been being buried in these cemeteries where they would have been open for business. So this was the period, and it allowed me to look at changes by decade, good archaeological method. I also wanted to know how people in the 19th century considered children, right? Like my stepchildren are 25 and 23, and we're still paying their health insurance. That's one way of thinking, you know, like we've expanded childhood. I mean, and that's great, but it's also, that wasn't happening. By the time you were 23 or 25 in the 19th century, you probably had children or, you know, of your own and were raising your own children. So how did people in the 19th century define children? And what I found in the Chicago Vital Records is there was a real distinction between infants, less than a year old, and then people less than 15 years old. Interestingly though, using 15 as my threshold, 90% of the graves I found were people who were 10 or under. So you have this period where it seems that if children made it past the age of 10, they actually did pretty well into sort of they mixed with the adult population if they were passing away after that. I then chose cemetery sections that gave me similar density and sort of counts to go through. And once I identified the sections I was going to use, I walked every row. I cannot tell you how much if you do that, your legs hurt. Oh my God, like cemeteries are like, they look nice and grassy. They're up and down and up and down and up and down. And it was really exhausting physically, and it was also exhausting emotionally to be just looking for dead children and reading epitaphs for dead children. It was so sad. So it was an interesting kind of research. I also wasn't able to obviously include any that didn't have dates, even if I knew they were for a child. I just couldn't. So let's look at a few things. First of all, who's getting commemorated? And I want to offer a quick comparison. I don't want you to have to look too hard at this, so I'll tell you what it's telling you. If we look at Chicago's vital records, we can see that and I'm just going to use this very first decade, 1867 to 76 of my research, 57% of people who died in Chicago were infants and children under the age of 5. That's not unusual. The national statistics show that people under 18, 70% of recorded deaths in 1850 were people under the age of 18. So a very high infant and child mortality rate is very common in 19th century America. And I give you the rough numbers. So it's about 2,800 infants and approximately 1,600 children under the age of 5 died in this one decade in the city of Chicago. Vital records are notoriously not that great because a lot of people don't get recorded. I mean, think of how hard it is right now during the pandemic to get accurate counts of who's dying of COVID. All those same problems existed in the 19th century. So if we look at the populations in Oak Hill and Rosewood, and I'm looking specifically at children who died and were commemorated outside of a family plot. So these are children who are predeceasing their parents, who have single graves, and that grave was never relocated to be with their family for whatever reason. If you look at that, you realize I couldn't read all the graves. You know, there are some that were moved, but if you look at it and you double the number to account for all of these things that might account for the fact they were moved or I couldn't read them, you would still have less than 500 children in 2 of the 3 major cemeteries in the city from that same time period. So you have almost 5,000 deaths and less than 500 graves. So this is already telling you if you're a child and you died in the 19th century in Chicago, odds are you never got a headstone, right? It doesn't. And if they're being buried somewhere else in other ways, unmarked graves, very few children are able to be commemorated by their families. So that's telling you something. When we see them being commemorated, how are they being commemorated? And what I've given you is a little bit of a tour of the most typical archaeological types of children's headstones. The one in the upper left is by far the kind of the most common. If I had to tell you this is a type of children's commemoration, what you see is on the front of the headstone, you see details of their life, who they are, when they were born, when they died, and they almost always, if in this style, not almost always, quite often have a nickname on the top. So if the child's name was Walter, it would say Wally on the top, or if it was William, it would be Willie, or Betsy instead of Elizabeth. Something, interestingly enough, that conveys in the largest possible font to a passerby a kind of intimacy with the child, right? It's not formal. It's saying this is Willie. It's not William. It's Willie. You know, something a little closer. You also see graves that have the same kind of message on the front, but on the top it's replaced with the lamb, which is a symbol that is only used in the 19th and 20th century for children. You don't see adults with lambs. It's just it's a child symbol, and it reflects their idea of their innocence, a death that happened too soon, very common. You then see, interestingly enough, specifically in the South, this transition at Oakwoods to this different kind of headstone in the later part of the 19th century. In the northern cemetery in Rose Hill and also in Graceland, you get these really simple granite blocks with very little detail, very formal graves. So you go from generally more intimate, more detail to less intimate and less detail over time. But these are, I would say there are a lot of adults that are buried with graves that look like this in the lower right. The other three, you rarely see adults with these headstones, almost never. They're almost exclusively for children. The final thing that I want to talk a little bit about is differences you can see, or sort of how I looked at sort of how we could see children's graves connecting to ideas about children and ideas about society at the time. And I did, in fact, find some real differences between Oakwoods and Rose Hill. And this, rather than looking at material and design, I'm looking specifically at the content of epitaphs where available. So you can see I have religious, whether they're at rest or asleep, that beautification of death. And then the ones that I have in pink here, this sort of pinky purple, are ones that to me were designed to convey intimacy and relationships. So possessive. There's a big difference. You can see it right here. Our darling. There's a big difference between saying Walter and our darling Walter, right? Saying he's ours, he's our child, is a way in, with very little money and very little extra expenditure, conveying the sense that this child was singularly important to you. You can also see the presence of nicknames, which I said is really common, and also the listing of the role that they played in your family. So were they a daughter, a son, a sibling, a grandchild? What is their relationship to other people? And you can see that there are significant differences between Oakwoods in the south and Rose Hill in the north. And you can also see changes in time where the beautification of death movement becomes far less important in terms of how children are being referred to, and the same for religion. The biggest surprise was I looked for laments, because there's a lot of writing about consolation literature in the 19th century for parents. And they write about how sad it is to lose a child. These were published in magazines and in books and all kinds of things. And I just didn't see that same kind of expression of sorrow on headstones that I might have expected. So the next question, and the last question is that if we only have so many children being commemorated, the question becomes why? Why are we commemorating these children, and why are some children being commemorated and not others? And I think that there are two things. The majority of families who are coming to Chicago in this period under study are either migrants from somewhere else in the United States, or they are immigrants to the United States. They're coming to this new city in Chicago. And I think that there are two specific dynamics that we can think about. First of all, when you're migrating and you're immigrating, most people are pretty impoverished. So that it's probably not a question of whether or not people would have liked to have given their child a burial with a headstone. It's that they probably, frankly, weren't able. The families that were able to or chose to allocate their resources that way, I would say, are probably doing it for one of a couple of reasons. One is most of these immigrants and migrants are investing less in their own families. We can see this archaeologically over and over in households, that adult personal artifacts, things to enrich the lives of adults, are far secondary, even in working class homes, to those of children. So children are getting more things than adults in these immigrant households. So if you spent all of this time and money investing in a child, hoping their life will be better, the American story, losing that child, especially when they're a little bit older, like India, who's 5, or this is Willie Omohundro, who's 12, your family has spent a lot of time and energy trying to start this next generation. So it's a very particular loss. And I think of this with Willie Omohundro's grave particularly. It's a very elaborate zinc, expensive grave. And the epitaph begins, "Oh, what hopes lie buried here." It's a lament of the future of the family, saying we put so much into him, we had so much hope. And not only is Willie buried there, his nickname, the hopes of our family is buried there too. I think that's very telling. The second side of this is you're migrants, you're immigrants, you're not from Chicago, you're not from the United States. What better way to stake a claim and show you belong than actually putting your family's blood in the soil? Your name is in a cemetery. The body of your child is here. You are in America now. You're in Chicago now. You have that. I mean, people have been doing that forever. Territories being marked with the bodies of their family members. I think that there's some of this too, and it's something that children specifically were doing in the context of these immigrant families. So with that, I want to make sure we have some time. So I'll leave you with little baby Meyer, who was only with us on this earth for 12 short days in 1897, and just say thank you. And I'll
Thank you,
stop screen.
Thank you, Dr. Baxter. You might want to keep your screen open just in case people have questions and you want to refer back to it.
Sure.
So we're not that big of a group. If somebody has a question, just go next to your name and unmute yourself and ask a question. We'll see how that goes. If it gets too noisy, then we'll have to go to like raising hands. Anyone want to go first?
And if I have my screen up, I can't see your hands. I don't have the participants up, so.
Okay,
I'll
take a look.
Jane, that we had 48 people watching you give this lecture, so that's a pretty good amount of people for one of our Zoom meetings.
Great. That's wonderful.
I have a question too. Have you studied
Sure.
the difference between European styles over the decades and American styles over the decades?
Can I talk about that a little bit? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, I can tell you a little bit about the 19th century based on one really good study that has been done, sort of addressing the same kind of thing, looking at children. I know there's someone in the audience who could talk about European cemeteries much better than I can. So hi, Michelangelo, maybe you'll have to hit him up for a question at some point. But there have been studies that have been done. There was a study that was done that compared burials in Lowell, Massachusetts, which had a very high Irish immigrant population, versus a series of cemeteries in Ireland to look at this very question. And they actually found that it was much more important in the United States to mention where you were born. So locations of birth is something that's a really critical part of this American thing. You see it quite often. You're born in Ireland, from Scotland, whatever, giving some kind of history. But also making sure that the child is named becomes much more common. So there's a little bit more detail that becomes clearly important that the authors have interpreted as being tied to immigration. Interestingly, there's a pretty close parallel between the United States and England. Although England goes to sort of lawn cemeteries earlier than we do, because they're an island. So the US, you know, we still have space if we want to do this, but so there tend to be more creative space solutions that occur earlier in Europe because there are space considerations. I mean, another example is in certain parts of Europe and Mediterranean countries, you only get to be buried for 5 years in the cemetery, and then your bones have to be moved somewhere else so that they can reuse the cemetery space. So there are issues of space, I think, that affect things that we don't quite face in the same way in the US. But there is a very similar arc where World War I seems to dramatically change death cultures on both sides of the Atlantic, and also in Canada. People have found it in Canada. And of course, they had a much greater death toll from World War I than we did. So it's not a really specific answer, but I can say that there is a general pattern of these Christian cemeteries that share that same point of origin and then end up all over.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
I think in one of your slides, it looked familiar. Is it St. Paul's that in London that has the restaurant in a crypt? I remember eating like really good food inside of a crypt in London.
Crypts are my favorite places to eat in Europe. I don't know what that says about me, but the food is usually excellent. St. Paul's is good. St. Martin in the Field is I usually, if I'm in London for a week, which happens relatively frequently, I eat there probably twice. Yeah, so it's a pretty common thing. St. Giles in Edinburgh has a fantastic little restaurant in the crypt. And because they use their churches in much more commonly in different ways, it's really nice. Like there's a noontime.
You're too noisy. Can you take it outside?
I was trying
There's a noontime piano concert in St. Giles Cathedral every day. So if you're traveling and your feet are tired, you can go get food downstairs, have a quick bite, go upstairs, enjoy the music in the church, and then keep moving on. So crypts are very, yeah, and churches, I think, have a much more secularized, integrated use than they have here in the United States quite often.
I have a question.
Sure.
When you say that in the really older European places, you can only be buried in the cemetery for 5 years, what happens to the bodies after 5 years? Where do they go?
They have, well, there's different solutions in different places. In some, your family takes you home and they'll cremate the remains and you get buried in a family space. In other places, there are communal bone houses where skeletons are compacted and placed in bone houses, much like old catacombs and kind of places like that were really condensing the dead and seeing them in a communal kind of way. So it does vary, but basically the cemetery is a very temporary space in a lot of European places. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, in some places you can go visit historic bone houses. My favorite is in Hallstatt in Austria, where everybody, when people were removed from the family plots, the families actually painted and decorated and labeled the skulls. So you know who's who because their skulls are beautifully decorated. With lovingly hand painted, and you can go into the bone house and just see this wall of decorated skulls with names and birth and death dates. Yeah, so there's a suite of practices. You know, overcrowding is a perennial cyclical problem with burial that humans seem to be encountering now that we live in such great numbers.
I can understand that, especially in places that have relatively small usable land areas.
Exactly. I know in Japan now, I know I'm going off, but there are actually where you have to be cremated by law now in Japan. And there are these warehouses you go to and you have a code number for your deceased loved one and you punch it into a little computer and a robot finds the urn in the great storehouse. I imagine the end of Indiana Jones when I think of this, like finding the right little box, and it brings the urn and sets it in front of the viewing window so you can visit your loved one, and then you push a button when you're done spending time and it puts them back wherever they are in the warehouse. it's extraordinary sort of how we cope with these issues of space, really pragmatic issues around death, not just emotional and social ones.
Well, that's fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Other questions or comments? Oh, if you're not able to talk too, you could, oh, I see. Let's see here. I have a question in the chat. So you can hit me up on chat if for some reason your microphone doesn't work. Being asked here by Bill Green, can you go into more detail about what would account for the observed differences between Rosehill and Oakwood cemeteries?
I can. They're speculative, but I think that what you realize when you look at the map, and I will sort of take advantage and go and show this map, is that these are, even though Chicago's here in the center, and again, the cemetery offices were in downtown Chicago. So you, no matter where you were living in the city very early on, you would have gone to the same location. And all the cemeteries had their offices in one building. And I think the other part of this about thinking about commemoration and the choice of whether or not to give a child a headstone was, were you someone who could afford the time and the cost of going to visit your child in a cemetery? And I think one of the considerations of that was burying your child in the place that was going to be easiest for you to access. So if you were someone who was living on the northern side of the city, you probably would have chosen Rosehill or Graceland, although Graceland was costlier. So that's another dynamic that I'm only starting to research, sort of the economics, the underlying economics of this. Or if you were further south, you probably would have chosen Oakwoods, again, just for ease of visitation, because these are, you know, this was 12 miles out of the city, 15 miles out of the city. And I think it has a lot to do with, if we look at ethnic compositions of ethnic neighborhoods where they were actually located in the city, it had to do with that. And I think also it had to do with not the prominence, but the frequency in which they were receiving burials at the time. So children's display tends to be greater at Oakwoods. It also tends to be, well, we don't think of it now because it's at 67th Street on the south side. It was the biggest, busiest cemetery early in the history of these. It seems to be in terms of the number of interments. So you would have had more visitors. There might have been a greater impetus for display very early on. So I think it's a combination of the communities that would have accessed them, and also which were the more popular and perhaps the more prominent at the time of the study. And I know that's vague, but you can't tie a lot of these back to people in vital records and particular families. The records do not allow it. I've tried to trace some of these kids and I get a lot of dead ends. So
I have a question just occurred to me.
sure.
In all the euphemisms that people were using for death, one of the common ones is to say that someone died of a broken heart. And I know there's a grave at Graceland of a man who lost his wife and children at the Iroquois Theater fire. Mm-hmm. And they say that he died, I think, a year or a year and a half later of a broken heart.
Yeah.
In those days, is that a euphemism for someone who committed suicide?
You know, I can't say. I think you might be able to find a record of it somewhere, but those are the kind of connections that are really hard to make, because nobody would have talked about the suicide anywhere unless it was in terribly public suicide, and maybe you could find it. I think that it is actually part of the expression. My short answer would be is that quite commonly it would be part of this culture that emphasized over sentimentality around death. These weeping figures, the sort of these poems and the books and all of these things, you were really supposed to mourn really hard. And I think that maybe it was a closeness in time, and it would have been a really popular way of reinforcing how much he cared about his family and how much he was grieving. So it could be in some cases, but I also think that it could be tied to this cultural movement that really emphasized this over expression of emotion at the time of somebody's death.
Hmm.
It might suggest that he actually meant it as opposed to just performing it. You never know. I mean, you know, there's that element too.
Yeah, but there was the short time period between when his family died and then a year later he died. It always made me wonder.
Well, and they've also shown, right, medically, they've done studies that show that people can die of a broken heart.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, I think it's sort of one of those things where folklore or sort of wives' tales about these kind of things actually has been substantiated by medical science.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
So, Dr. Baxter, you were saying that you were having trouble when you look at some of the graves tracing the family?
Yeah, I mean, the children that I looked at specifically are children who were not included in family graves. So there are children buried from this period. So think about it like you come to a city and you have the chance to purchase a family plot, but it's probably not a priority when you first arrive and you're younger and healthier. And in this case, you're the patriarch of a family. There are children's graves from this period that are probably where children were moved to after the plot was purchased, and they're placed in those family plots. Those children are pretty easy to trace because you have this entire genealogy in one spot. You have the family stone in the middle and all the smaller ones around it. These are children who were buried and nobody else comes to be buried with them 90% of the time. So they're a single name. And they were never like reclaimed and relocated into a family plot. They're really, their families might not have even died here. So.
Yeah, I don't know if this is helpful or not, but I've been playing around with my genealogy, trying to learn, and I do notice checking out other people's public trees on Ancestry.com and how passionate people are with documenting this about their own family and even other families, linking together, siblings or they would have been like, distant, aunts or uncles, including those in their trees.
Thank you. I mean, it's not a route I've pursued with a lot of vigor because I've been interested in these general questions. But,
sure.
It's worth always trying, to sort of see if you can find a couple and see if it's something that would bear fruit later. And my efforts were unsuccessful, but that doesn't mean there aren't ways that it could become successful.
Well, you mentioned Find a Grave too. I think that might have the same funding that Ancestry does because they seem to be connected quite together. They're, I think, all backed by Mormon people or organizations.
They are. Because if you go back far enough, we're all Mormon, and that you can find it on Ancestry and Find a Grave, right? I think
well, I think they like to convert their ancestors. There's something to that. Yeah. Interesting stuff. Actually, I'd like to find out more about the Mormon War in Missouri.
Yeah,
for regional history, archaeology. Yeah. Do we have more questions, comments? If you cannot use your microphone, feel free to chat. Put it in the chat.
I do have a question. Going back to Oakwood Cemetery.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, going back to Oakwood Cemetery, I have an immigrant relative who lost a young one and buried the child there. So when I went back to Oakwoods to do some research, genealogically research, there's a whole section of single graves, a large section of single graves where all the stones have been removed.
Yes.
And those are the ones that are not showing up in your research because you have no stones to read as you walk along. But yet my immigrant ancestor whose child died in that time period definitely had a stone there at one point in time.
Some of them were ephemeral. I mean, that's the nature of archaeology. We can only see what's left to be preserved long enough for us to do the study. Right. And I can only look at and read headstones that were put and allow for that. And yes, and over in that section, I know what section you're talking about, there are mass graves of 1918 pandemic victims. There are pauper graves from city institutions and poorhouses. It's so it's a real mishmash of who was in that area. And certainly like in Catholic cemeteries, if the child wasn't baptized yet, they certainly weren't going to be there. So there are areas of unmarked graves leading up into Catholic cemeteries quite often. In Ireland, they're called Cellini, that when the parents were alive, they went and tended these unmarked graves because they knew where their children were, but they don't exist in perpetuity with headstones of a quality that would have lasted. So, yeah.
But that's a whole section of single graves.
Mm-hmm.
And I think probably like at the time that the immigrants were working at the Pullman Company, single graves would have been purchased. There would have been markers there, but the graves were never moved. The headstones were never moved to the family plot.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They're now unmarked and kind of lost, and they weren't of a quality that they lasted or were kept. You know, I mean, cemeteries are complicated places in terms of what archaeologists would call post-depositional processes. We think of them as never changing and never moving. If you look at the 1920 map of Oakwoods, there are 3 lakes, but they're much larger. They've now shrunk them. They've changed everything. I mean, that cemetery has changed so radically between now and when it was established. So there's all kinds of changes on the landscape for sure.
Mm-hmm.
We also know archaeologically that a lot of times really poor children in working class neighborhoods, there haven't, I don't know of any excavated here in Chicago, but in New York City, it's been very common in their problems. They find babies in privies all the time.
Mm-hmm.
The skeletal remains of infants. Because they couldn't afford to put them anywhere. So that it's a really complicated process of sort of who ends up with a really nice headstone that I can see in the 21st century.
Yes, interesting.
Have you found any caches of headstones that have been removed, like a dump filled with like old headstones in the Chicago area?
Not at these big cemeteries. At smaller ones, you can see them often at the edge of cemeteries in different municipalities, but not these big city cemeteries, no. I think they're a little more discreet, to be honest with you. There are some things, like if you go to Bohemian National, there are headstone pieces and porcelain pictures of people, and they ask anybody if you come in to say, who is this? Do you know who this is? Because they've fallen off of headstones and they have no idea. But most of the broken parts of headstones, if they're large, they're left in situ. If they're not, they tend to be disposed of in a way that is, I think, designed to be a little more comforting to the typical visitor. But certainly when you go to smaller cemeteries, you see them all the time in the woods, you know, behind the back dirt pile kind of thing.
Sure. Yeah, I was walking through Labatt Woods over the summer, and I saw a whole bunch of just like broken pieces, looked like stone and cement, and I'm just like, what is this? Is this part of a grave or whatnot? So I was just a bit of mystery. Saw some bones there. My friend picked them up, and I think they were deer bones, but I was like, I don't know if they're human. If you want to bring those back to your house,
Yeah.
might get into some trouble. We had a really good comment here about Ancestry.com, because it's a very expensive service, I know firsthand. But you can, using your library card, from what I understand, use your library card to access Ancestry.com for free.
That's great.
It's the
I've got a question.
library edition.
Oh,
So you
Jean?
can normally you could use it in the library if your library subscribes. It's a library edition of Ancestry.com, but normally public libraries don't allow you to use it remotely. But during COVID,
Correct.
you can. So
That's
yeah,
correct.
so it's just another good tool.
I've got a question for you, Dr. Baxter.
Sure.
When the Civil War detention camps were here in Andersonville, where did they bury all the bodies that died?
Oakwoods.
Of the POWs, yeah, there are POW burial grounds in different cemeteries, so you can find them. Oh my goodness, like I'm drawing a blank because normally there's a really famous one here. I think there's a section in Rose Hill. There's a small section in Oakwoods, I believe, and then there are some in a few other Chicago area cemeteries. So they did bury POWs in military style graves in these cemeteries as well.
Thank you.
But I'm drawing a blank, and I apologize.
That's all right.
But they do exist. You can find sort of the German POWs are buried in some of the Chicago cemeteries.
Oh, Civil War.
Oh, and the Civil War as well. Yeah, there's a huge, which cemetery, sorry, somebody probably knows, has the huge Confederate monument in it?
Oakwoods.
Oakwoods, thank you, yeah.
Okay.
Been talking for a while. You can tell, not immediate recall. It's a really beautiful military memorial.
Now, why would they have a Confederate memorial in Chicago?
That's easy.
Yes?
Oh, there were lots of prisoner of war camps here and in World War II, and not everybody could be moved home. So just like there are giant American cemeteries in Europe from World War II and World War I and Canadian, it's the same thing. Embalming was invented or developed in the American Civil War, specifically so that bodies could be shipped home. But over time, not everybody could afford it. Not everybody could afford to have a body transported back. And so people were buried where they died.
But linking to the Confederacy, there wasn't a resentment. It didn't anger the people that lived here.
No, I mean, it's a remarkable memorial. So I
Okay.
think part of reparations and healing in the American Civil War was focused on sort of building those kinds of bridges. So,
Okay.
ultimately, I don't know that they built the big monuments didn't happen during the war, but over time, you would have had the Daughters of the Confederacy and other groups choosing to commemorate the people who weren't able to be brought back.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason of my interest in all these things is to try to see things through the eyes of people that lived in that time, not in the time that we live in now, which is, of course, very different. How we would interpret these things and how we feel about these things.
Absolutely.
Do we have more questions, comments? Oh, I see here another mention about research and ancestry. FamilySearch.com has a lot of the same things as Ancestry.com and is free. I've looked at both, and I have found that Ancestry being better and get some of the stuff first. And I think there's actually some stuff in the organization where they give it to Ancestry first and then eventually give it to Family Search, trying to get, basically make money off of the stuff. But yeah, Family Search is a great resource.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments?
Hi, this is Lucy Kennedy. You can't see me. I'm the admin box in the upper left-hand corner.
Hi.
Can you hear me? You can hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. With my church choir, I went to Vienna in 2009, Vienna, Austria, and they have a huge, very old cemetery around Vienna. And many of the most important of the world's classical musicians are buried there. Beethoven, Brahms, Johann Strauss, if I think long enough, I can think of more. And people can buy tickets to have a guided tour on 3 different levels, just the 4 biggest ones, most famous, most important ones, and then like the slightly less famous ones, including the 4 big ones, and then just the whole cemetery. And people, there's a website and you can order tickets, and people come from all over the world to see Vienna. And while they're there, they go see the cemetery. I mean, there's a charge. It's a profit-making venture for the city of Vienna. The people want to see tombstones. Some of them are quite ornate, especially like Beethoven and stuff. And the other thing is, in recent years, I think there has been a real trend toward cremation. I don't know if in the future there will be as many ornate or well-designed tombstones for people like you to be investigating. I've gone to something like 6 or 7 funerals in the last 5 or 6 or 7 years, and all but one of them was a cremation. I think it's so much less expensive, I think is why people do it. And in church, when I was a girl, when we did the confession of faith, the last couple of lines were, I believe in this, I believe in that, and I believe in the resurrection of the body and the life everlasting. Well, they don't talk so much about the resurrection of the body nowadays. It doesn't seem to be so important to people anymore. And so I just think the world is getting away from being buried in graves and embalmed bodies and coffins and with tombstones. And it's going to be very different, like Japan, as you said.
Yeah.
So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And I think so. And, you know, I mean, a big thing is the Catholic Church, which was sort of one of the big holdouts. I was raised Catholic. I'm not practicing Catholic any longer, but you know, my parents are going to have Catholic burials, but they are being cremated. And, you know, when my father told me, he said, I never imagined that this would have been something that was even available to me. But when the Vatican made the change, which I think was a very pragmatic change, they don't consider it ideal, but it is now allowed. And there are whole web pages for Catholics on how to understand cremation within Catholic theology, which I find very, very interesting. But yeah, I think that's absolutely a trend. And so are these more interesting events in cemeteries. I know a couple years ago in England, they had a pop-up bar in Highgate Cemetery, so you could go have a drink with Karl Marx. And it was a way of raising money for Highgate Cemetery. So cemetery tourism is an increasing thing of how do you make money out of these spaces that are no longer profitable because you can't take in new burials. They're finding more and more ways to integrate them into the world of the living again. So again, I think it's a pendulum that's swinging.
Well, in these times where we're not really able to do a whole lot, right? Our entertainment and ability to go out and socialize is like almost nothing at this point. But visiting cemeteries could be a very good outlet for getting a good walk and getting outside, some breath of fresh air, and you're socializing with people that well, they're gone. I mean, they can't infect you. They can't say much either.
Actually, Chicago cemeteries closed down for a while when COVID started because they were becoming overrun with people using them instead of public parks. And they said it was very hard. My colleague, Michelangelo Giampaoli, who is here graciously listening to this talk for the second time, did an interview with the director of Rose Hill, and he was saying, you know, we were limiting the number of people having to 10 at a memorial event, and there were 600 people jogging around the cemetery, and it was very hard to have these two things co-occurring. So they've actually shut the cemeteries at various times because of this, because people are using them for recreation. So I always think cemeteries are a wonderful place for a walk, no matter what the public health conditions, and would advocate for that. But like I said, the other thing that's really kind of cool is you can go to a lot of these cemeteries on Google Maps and get really down on to the point that you can see headstones and layouts and landscapes. Like I said, my students do this using Google Earth, and then you can use Street View, and the Google car does drive through a lot of these rural garden cemeteries, and you can stop it and look and enjoy. I've taken tours of many cemeteries during lockdown via the Google car. So it's something you can adapt.
Well, any recommendations about how to do this safely and respectfully?
You know, I have a cemetery etiquette guide that I give my students.
Okay.
And I would say, you know, the number one thing I would say is almost every cemetery has a website. Go to the website before. If they don't have a website, and even if they do, they have a list of rules posted outside the gates of the cemetery. And I would say follow what they ask you to do. Some of them, you know, Graceland doesn't allow picnicking. My dream has been to let my students have a picnic in a rural garden cemetery, you know, relive the experience of the religion. You can't. They just never allow it. Whereas other cemeteries, that's totally fine. So I think it's look and see what they ask you to do and be respectful of the rules. And to always be aware that there are people using cemeteries for a variety of reasons, and to give people the space to have the kind of experience they need to have. If it's a memorial or grieving, then you don't need to be walking up to the next headstone because it looks interesting, you know? So I think there is that sense of the fact that people grieve differently and different traditions memorialize people differently, and people use cemeteries for all kinds of reasons. So that mutual respect is critical.
Great feedback. Any other questions or comments? We're past 5 o'clock here, so we should be saying goodbye soon.
Jane, before you leave, you might want to look at the chats because people have said some nice things about you in chat.
Aw, well, thank you, everybody.
Take a look at chat.
I will. And I have to say thank you to some of my, some people who I know who showed up just for me today, including my amazing graduate student, Lauren Finnegan. And so thank you for people who came. And thank you so much to everybody.
Thank you.
Jane, could you
I will also say, let me put in the chat, if anybody has any questions, my email address, and I would be happy to answer questions that come up later. That would be fine.
Jane, I'm putting together the Codex article on your talk.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I'm wondering if you could, if I send you my email address, could you send me some bibliography and some of your URLs and the references, so that if people want to do some of their following up?
Absolutely, I can make for further reading and sort of places to go. Absolutely, and I put my email in the chat, so please go ahead and send away.
Okay, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, of course, my pleasure.
And just a final reminder, if you liked what you saw here today and you'd like to join the Chicago Archaeological Society, please go to chicagoarchaeologicalsociety.com. If you'd like to join our mailing list, info@chicagoarchaeology.org. There are different URLs, by the way. Please visit, click join. And next month, please come back. We will have Dr. Robert Ebb Morrissey, January 31st, 2021. We're going to be in a new year at 3:30 p.m. In the middle of everything, the power of Indigenous Illinois in early America. All right. Any final comments or questions before we say goodbye today? I'd like to say thank you very much, Dr. Baxter. As always, interesting talk, wonderful information.
Thank you, everyone, for coming and for hosting me. It was really a wonderful time. I appreciate it so much.
Take care, everyone.